וידבר השם משה במדבר סיני בשון השניס לצייס מארץ מצרים. Hashem spoke to Moshe in the Sinai desert the second year after they had left Egypt, B'chodesh Rishon Lemor, in the first month, which is Nisan. V'yasub Bnei Yisrael saposach b'moado, and the Bnei Yisrael, they had made the Pesach in its time. When is its time? When does the Pesach brought the Paschal lamb? B'arbosa yom b'chodesh hazer, on the 14th day of the month, Bein Arabayim, that's after midday. Tasu also, b'modo, you should do it in its time. Chokosov, Chol Mishpotov, Tasu also. Meaning all the criteria. Rashi explains, it has to be a sheep, it has to be a male, it has to be less than a year old. Chol Mishpotov, and according to all its laws, Elo hamitzah shal gufa mochmachgon shivas yomim lamatzah. You must eat matzah for 7 days. It'll be chometz. It must be roasted with fire. It has to be roasted whole, so on and so forth. So over here, we find there was a Korban Pesach brought in Egypt before we left Egypt. This is the first Korban Pesach we're bringing as a Jewish people after Kabbalas HaTorah in Sinai. This is the second year. So Rashi explains, we already began Bamidbar when we were counted. When we were counted, in the second month of the second year. That's how the book of Bamidbar begins. So if we go sequentially speaking, and the second Korban Pesach was brought in the first month of the second year, what should be the first thing spoken about at the beginning of the Chumash Bamidbar? It was the beginning of the second year, the first month, on the 14th day. Hashem had said to Moshe, it's time to bring the Korban Pesach, the Paschal lamb. But yet, the first thing we speak about is on the second month of the second year. And now, after all the counting and all the different levels of responsibility, we speak about the Korban Pesach, which is brought in the second year in the first month. Parsha Shebarosh HaSefer Lo Nemra Ariyar. The portion at the beginning of the book was only spoken about, mentioned in the second month, Iyar. Lamadato she'en mugda mucha b'Torah. So we see the Torah doesn't necessarily state things sequentially, and it's obvious. We begin with the second month, and then we speak about the first month. V'loma l'posach b'zu, but the question is, why not? Factually, if the Korban Pesach was brought on the first month of the second year, why does it first speak about the second month, and then we shift back to the first month, which is obvious that it's not sequential? Because this points out something which is negative. It reflects something negative about the Jewish people. This is the only Korban Pesach during this 40-year period. When we entered into the desert, this was the only Korban Pesach brought. After this Korban Pesach, there was no other Korban Pesach brought until we crossed the Yarden, the Jordan, with Yeshua, and afterwards, that was the third Korban Pesach that Jewish people had brought since the first. That was the third. But for 40 years, only in the second year, that was the only Korban Pesach that was brought. So this reflects something negatively about the Jewish people. So as a result of that, we try to somehow to conceal it. It shouldn't be as obvious. Alan, one second. Wait 1 second.
Oh, I'm sorry.
This is the Chazal. That's where the Torah writes out of sequence for this reason. Because to begin with something which it's obvious, reflects negatively about the Jewish people, Torah doesn't want to begin with such a thing. What's the reason? We find that soon we're going to speak about the Chet HaMeraglim, where we're about to go in, and then the Jews say we want to send scouts to scout out the land. And because of that, the Jews forfeited their right to go in immediately, and we wandered for 39 years, and only after that generation, between 20 and 60, passed away, only then the new generation was able to go in. During this time, the Gemara tells us, there's a certain northerly wind which blows, which contributes to the clotting factor in the blood, which when you circumcise, the blood clots, and the person doesn't bleed to death. As a result of the Chet HaMeraglim, the sin of the spies, this wind did not blow. And because of that, circumcision would have been a question of what? Of putting the child's life in jeopardy. So for those years going forward, there was no longer circumcision. You could only bring a Korban Pesach if the person himself is circumcised and every member of his family is circumcised, every male. So since after the second year, circumcision was no longer relevant, so any children born to the Jewish people were no longer, didn't have bris milah, so therefore they weren't able to bring the Korban Pesach. So the not bringing of the Korban Pesach, what did it reflect? It reflected the Chet HaMeraglim. It's not just they didn't bring the Korban Pesach. The reason why you didn't bring the Korban Pesach is because despite the fact, after seeing everything, the miracles and the hand of Hashem, in the most obvious, irrefutable level, the Jews lacked trust, didn't trust God. And because of that, that generation had to perish. So as a result of that, rather than this being the first thing mentioned and the takeaway immediately is obvious, that was the degree of our failing, the Torah wants to soften it a little bit. So it doesn't begin the Sefer Bamidbar with the Korban Pesach, because this is the only Korban Pesach for another 39 years until we go into Eretz Yisrael. Because it reflects Gnus and Shel Yisrael, the Gnus, the negativity, the criticism of the Jewish people. We find the beginning of the Chumash Dvarim. The Chumash Dvarim is referred to as Mishnah Torah. Moshe Rabbeinu, since he's going to pass away in 36 days after he begins speaking, he reviews the Torah in its entirety, most of the mitzvahs that were discussed, but it begins with words of rebuke. Moshe Rabbeinu gathers all the Jewish people, and he reviews the history of his relation with the Jewish people from the time we left Egypt until that present moment. Words of admonishment, words of rebuke, and he has all the Jews there because he said, if anybody's not present, they'll say, if we would have been there, we would have said something. So he says, you're all here now, let each man speak his piece if you have what to say. Otherwise, you openly, clearly admit that whatever I say is a valid criticism. All those criticisms, all the admonishment, are all through allusions. It's not obvious. You read over there, Rashi, there's certain references, Di Zahov as locations, or Chatzeros. So Rashi over there cites Rabbi Yochanan. He says, I reviewed all the geography of the various locations, and I haven't come upon such places. There's no such places known as Di Zahov. So what is it referring to? It's referring to the sins that the Jews had actually committed at those certain locations, except to maintain the honor of the Jewish people, to openly state their failings, it's not appropriate. So therefore, when we speak, you know what I'm talking about, and the one who's speaking knows what he's talking about. But to say it explicit, what it was, it's not appropriate according to the honor of Israel, because all we want to do is get the point across. So if you read and decipher it as you should decipher, which is not that difficult, you understand what we're talking about. But we should say openly, the golden calf, the spies, the this, the that, and what degree they failed, it's Gnus and Shel Yisrael. The Torah doesn't want to display the open failings, inappropriate behavior of the Jewish people. Therefore, the Torah tones it down a little bit. So there, it's through allusion. Over here, we're speaking of bringing the Korban Pesach. And there was an event. Therefore, there's no other way to speak this fact. Therefore, rather than beginning the Sefer Bamidbar with the Korban Pesach, where the obvious question is, this was the only one, and what is the reason? Because we weren't worthy of going in, and therefore, and the northerly wind did not blow, so we weren't able to bring Korban Pesach because we were not able to circumcise our children. It's very interesting. We find that the Levium, Moshe Rabbeinu, when he blesses the Levium, before he passes away, he says, Urechov tumech ish chasidecha, then it says, Ubrischa yitzoru. The Levium, they kept the bris. So Rashi over there explains on that pasuk that despite the fact that Jews did not circumcise themselves, Shevet Levi did circumcise themselves. So the question is, again, the halacha is, and we were studying now in Yevomis, that an Orel is not permitted to eat truma. Person is uncircumcised. If he's a Kohen, he's not permitted to eat truma. And what's the case of Orel, that he's not permitted to eat truma? That two of his brothers died due to circumcision, meaning they were hemophiliacs. So the halacha is, you're not permitted to circumcise the third child. Since two of the brothers already died, so we're establishing what we call a pattern, and we have to be concerned that if we circumcise the third child, he will die. So therefore, the third child's an onus. He had no choice. He's not permitted to circumcise himself. Nevertheless, that since he has that foreskin, he's not qualified to eat the truma. Same thing with the Korban Pesach. The Jews in the desert, they were arelim. They were uncircumcised. And they weren't permitted. It doesn't make a difference. Factually, if you have the foreskin, you're not qualified to eat Korban Pesach. It's a question of pikuach nefesh. So why was Shevet Levi? Pikuach nefesh, you want to be a hero. Factually, if there's this very serious concern, you may die. How did Levi cross that line? And evidently, they didn't die. Or the majority didn't die. They all circumcised themselves. Now, Levi was not part of the Chet HaMeraglim. They were not. If you remember, Levi was counted differently than the rest of the Jewish people. They were counted from days of 30. They were 30 days old. That's how they were counted. The Klal Yisrael, they were counted from the age of 20. The males were counted from the age of 20 and above. So Rashi over there says, and the Torah says, I do not want Levi should be counted as the rest of Jewish people are counted. Why? Because Levi is my legion, my personal legion. Why then personal legion? Because since they did not participate in the Chet Egel at all, therefore they should be not counted with the rest of the Jews, because when I will decree that Klal Yisrael should perish over the 39-year period, Levi will not be part of that decree. But if they counted together, there were many Jews who did not participate in the Chet HaMeraglim. Nevertheless, but the decree was on the Jewish people, and since they were part of that counting, the decree was on the group. So Levi had to be counted separately. He should not be part of that group. So seemingly, that Levi, because they were at a different level, that despite all the challenges, Levi was always met the challenge. Evidently, they merited, meaning we speak about Teva and L'mala min Teva. We speak of the natural order, and we speak about something that supersedes nature. Levi always lived their lives. Despite the influences of Egypt, Levi were never idolaters. Levi was never in the bondage. Levi was never subject to the influences of Egypt. They were never Ovdei Avodah Zorah. When the angels claimed, when we were passing through the Red Sea, Elo Ovdei Avodah, Elo Avodah Zorah, why the Jews less culpa than the Egyptians? The claim was not against Levi, but nevertheless, Levi was part of the Jewish people. And the Jewish people are receiving the Torah at Sinai. Hashem answered. But Levi themselves were never in any way tainted to any degree. They were not subject to the influences. When you live a life where you're not subject to influences, that means your whole persona doesn't function within the laws of nature. So because they themselves lived their lives where they superseded the influences and they transcended those influences, therefore they were not subject to the natural criteria of existence that you need the northerly wind to bring about that clouding factor. As a result of that, Levi circumcised themselves. And then their lives were not put in jeopardy. Because Levi, God deals with Levi differently. There's a word, I once mentioned the name of the Maharal of Prague, which is an obvious question. We find that Moshe Rabbeinu, before he passes away, the Torah gives us a health update. Health update. That it was what? It was Noslecho, Lo Koseino. His vibrancy was not in any way diminished, despite the fact he was 120 years old. His eyesight was perfect. His strength was, as a young man, why is this important for us to know? To say he was Onav Mikol Adam, which we're going to speak about at the end of this parsha, he was the most humble person who ever walked the face of the earth, that's his spirituality. But that he had his vibrancy and his eyesight, and he had the health of a young person, and Rashi Afil Bekever, even the grave, he was there like a living human being, although he was not alive. His physicality remained fully intact. Why is that important for us to know? So he goes to explain, the Maharal, that what is the state of physical existence? It's cause and effect. Meaning, whatever exists is always affected by its environment. That's the reason a person's born. As he gets older, he advances, then he wanes. Something grows, it advances, then it dies. And everything is due to what? To the influences of the environment. You have bread, you bake it, it's fresh. As time goes on, it becomes stale, eventually it turns to dust. That's the effect of the environment. Anything because that's affected. Moshe Rabbeinu, the Torah is saying he was an unaffected person. Therefore, he did not age. He was 120 years old, but he did not age. Therefore, the Torah is saying, what's the proof he did not? He was an unaffected person. Throughout his life, Lo Noslecho. His vibrancy did not in any way diminish. His eyesight was like a young man. His strength was in place. That's only indication he lived his life as a spiritual being to be totally unaffected. That is the Maharal. That's why the Torah is giving us this update on his health situation, that Moshe affected, he was never effected. He was never affected, he affected others. That's the Maharal. Shevet Levi had a semblance of that, not the degree of Moshe Rabbeinu. Therefore, although when the northerly wind doesn't blow, the clotting factor doesn't work, and therefore a person would bleed to death, that had no relevance to Shevet Levi. That's Teva. That's on the natural order. But since Levi always lived their lives to be unaffected, as in Egypt, the influence of Egypt did not affect them, and they were the teachers, they were the disseminators of Torah. As it says in the Chazal, that they would go out into the fields and they would have scrolls and they would teach them about the patriarchs and about the Shev Mitzvahs Bnei Noach, the 7 Noahide laws, about various things. So the core, that they were able to retain their identity, as it says, they didn't change their dress, their language, or their names. That was due to Levi's influence, because Levi was the one who was not affected by the environment whatsoever.